AskReddit by Galbial. What famous person did you meet, not realizing who they were until later? My wife and I went to a baseball game for my birthday and splurged on really good seats behind home plate. The man sitting next to my wife was friendly, talking with us occasionally during the game. The next day I watched a replay of the game and discovered we were next to Wayne Gretzky. I managed my way down to where the teams came out of the locker room after a Blue Jackets Coyotes game. Gretzky was coaching the Coyotes, so everyone was eagerly waiting for him to come out. While waiting, I got to chatting with this extremely nice older gentleman who I presumed to be a bus driver, very blue collar, and I remember him saying things like "you better get in there if you want to meet him," etc. I later found out it was Wayne Gretzky's father. Couldn't have been nicer. I bumped into Tommy Lee, literally, at the Philly airport, years ago. I was too distracted by a guy in a lavender 3-piece suit, and didn't even notice Tommy. Turns out, dude was his assistant, who was dressed like that and walking a bit away from Tommy to purposely distract people from him. That's actually really smart. Was visiting Greece with my family when I was about 4 in the late 80s. We were at the Parthenon wandering around. At one point, distracted, I go to hug the leg of a person I thought was my dad. Looked up and it was not my dad, he was like 5 feet away looking the other way. Apparently it was Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris can be your dad if he wants to. I exchanged a "hi, how's it going" to Owen Wilson in the line of a local coffee shop in Malibu a few years back. My wife told me after we left that it was Owen. He had shades and a trucker hat on. I was too tired to notice. Wow. Shabbily dressed dude and some family walked into a very casual BBQ place in Ohio. Kinda walked around before sitting down, and an odd vibe. Hardly anyone in the place though, so I watched him as he was just a little off. We walked out and I said to my wife, "What was up with that dude?" "Oh, you mean Eric Clapton?" This story is from a family friend who worked with a guy who lived next to his in-laws. He's trying to go to bed and the neighbors are having a small party next door. Guy turns to his wife and says that's the worst Clapton cover I've ever heard. He runs into his neighbors a few days later. In chatting he mentions the party and the guy playing guitar. The neighbors said, "Oh yeah, our son-in-law Eric was over." And that's how he learned he lived next door to Eric Clapton's in-laws. I was at a dive bar and some band was absolutely butchering Cherry Pie by Warrant, and I asked the waitress who the awful band was. Turns out it was Warrant. I had an experience like this once at a White Sox game. For the entertainment they had a bunch of old guys playing a cover of Eye of the Tiger. Only later did I realize those old guys were in fact Survivor. I had a conversation with a short, gorgeous American redhead backstage at a Bauhaus concert in Europe in 1998. It was kind of nice to have a conversation with another American because I felt sort of out of place. About 2 minutes later, someone came through and said, "Has anybody seen Debbie Harry?" and that's when it clicked. In my defense, I had never seen her without blonde hair and never would have expected to see her at another band's show on a different continent unless Blondie was touring on the same bill. I've heard she's extremely friendly to other people unless you start the conversation as a fan. Didn't exactly meet. Was staring at this guy at the water park wondering why everyone was also watching the same guy. It was Adam Sandler filming Grown Ups. My dad asked Jim Belushi what he did for a living. Sometimes I think he has some sort of facial blindness. And to this day, Jim Belushi is still trying to think of an answer. George Harrison, a Beatle. A Beatle. Walked into an empty corporate box at the Adelaide F1 Grand Prix during practice sessions. He nodded to me, I nodded to him, thinking I knew his face from somewhere while I continued making phone calls. I only realized as he gave me another nod on the way out after 10 minutes. I corpsed. A fucking Beatle. The most famous person in this whole thread. John Denver bumped into me at the Aspen Balloon Festival in the early 1980s. Knocked me down. He was sweet and kind. I had no idea who knocked me over until my friend told me. I'm so jealous. I saw a guy on a plane in 2010 who looked just like him. I told him so and he asked why I even knew who that was because I was pretty young. I loved John Denver growing up and always listened to him with my dad. I was at the store with my mom and we were at the checkout counter behind the tallest man I'd ever seen in my life. Unbelievably tall. I asked him his height and he said 7 feet 6 inches. Then I asked him if he played basketball and he laughed and said everybody asks him that question. 2 weeks later I saw the same man from the store playing basketball on television. It was Sean Bradley, one of the tallest players to ever play in the NBA. Chandeliers and ceiling fans are not his friend. I delivered a Starbucks order to Kristen Bell when my career wasn't doing so well. She was fantastic, beautiful for sure, had one of her kids in tow. Didn't even recognize her as I was doing the delivery, just happy that it was someone kind, and tipped well. It wasn't until I got home and was watching Good Place that I put it all together. I know her stepdad. Guy was doing some wiring in an optometrist's office I was working in. Played along, thinking it was bullshit. Until he shows me pictures of him and Dax Shepard, her husband, in one of Dax's cars. I had a very pleasant phone conversation with an older British gentleman who introduced himself as Tony. It took me way too long to realize it was Sir Anthony Hopkins. On another occasion, I kept looking across the room at someone because he looked so damn familiar. Finally he came over to me and said, "Okay, you're looking at me like we went to high school together or something. Hi, I'm Will," and then I shook Will Wheaton's offered hand lol. I have almost the same story. Will Wheaton in New Orleans. Sat next to him at a restaurant while a con was in town. I was super hungry and tired and could not figure out why he looked so familiar. Waitress sat us next to each other because we were both from California. Also introduced himself as Will. He complimented my Star Trek shirt. Much later I realized it was Wesley Crusher all grown up and was too sleep deprived to realize. About 10 or so years ago I was out on my friend's Bucks night. As a gift, my friend's father-in-law had gotten us on the guest list for some high-end function near where we were kicking off. The last thing I remember before waking up in the taxi was 5 shots being lined up in front of me. That's when my friend asks, "So what were you and Heath Ledger talking about?" Turns out it was the premiere party for the film Ned Kelly and several people had spotted myself and Heath deep in conversation. Edit. 20 years ago. Fuck, I'm old. I'm sorry to inform you of this, but that was 20 years ago. Tom. The MySpace Tom. Me and my friend were at Disneyland in like 2008. We realized late on our last day that we forgot to take any pictures, so we were running around trying to get as many as we could. We were at the front gate and wanted to get one last photo of the two of us in front of the Mickey flowers. We asked a group close to us if someone could take our photo. A guy in a white shirt and jeans said he would. After he snapped the picture, he said, "I better see that on MySpace tomorrow," and walked away. The group left the park. It was a weird thing to say, so we just have each other confused looks. Then, in proper movie-like slow-mo, we looked back at the group, realization dawning on us. We looked back at each other and screamed LMAO. We told that story for years. I bet it went straight on MySpace. Sad that most MySpace pages were accidentally deleted. To be fair, I was a child at the time. But whoever played the original Red Power Ranger. Got to meet them and child me only said I don't like Power Rangers. Austin St. John. I spent a few pleasant minutes talking with a very Scottish lady in a fairly quiet Parisian art gallery in Montmartre earlier this year. We discussed how some impressionists were actually pretty awful and that a lot of what is exhibited might be historically interesting, but is still shite. Annie Lennox. Ooh, this is the first one I've really been jealous of. I've had Diva on like twice a week recently. Shaun White. He was with Nina Dobrev and I was over the moon to see her. She was so sweet. Closest person around us was him, so I asked if he could take a pic of us. He was polite and said of course. Told him he looked so familiar and he said he got that a lot. Couple weeks later they went IG official and I felt like such an idiot, lol. Deleted. I sold Susan Sarandon a rug at a weird side job I had a few years ago. She was wearing a mask, so I didn't realize who she was until I saw the name on her credit card receipt. Not me, but many years ago my granny was on a flight and got home and said, "Oh, I met the nicest man on the plane. He's a musician." We had a lovely conversation. That man was Carlos Santana. She didn't even get an autograph. Sat next to Coolio at a blackjack table in Las Vegas. Chatted away, hadn't a clue who he was. Mate of mine saw us and later asked me what I was talking to Coolio about. I worked at a gaming company years ago, and he came up to our counter at E3 one year, the Electronics Entertainment Expo, the big one in gaming. Very, very nice dude. But about half as nice as Mario Andretti, who we hired one year as our celebrity endorsement. We had one of his cars that he won the Indy 500 in 1 year jacked up almost sideways, so you could look at the underside, in our booth. One of the nicest people I've ever met, and his assistant with her ear constantly in her cell phone, as well. He went and got coffee for us several times, was constantly offering to sign autographs unbidden, and treated every single person in our booth and in the crowd with the utmost respect and dignity. I found myself thinking that if I worked for him, I'd be up until 6 AM the morning of the race making sure that everything on his car was absolutely perfect. His was the kind of humble personality you go to war for. My wife and I were walking in New York looking for a bar we had heard about, when we noticed a couple walking towards us. We were a little lost, so we asked them for directions. He pointed us in the right direction while she looked like she was trying not to be noticed. We thanked them and went on our way. As we got to the bar, my wife said, "That was Emma Stone. We met her and Andrew Garfield and didn't even think twice about it." That is awesome. And very nice of Andrew to help you, which only supports the fact that he seems like an all-around great guy. I don't know if this counts because I was too young to really understand what fame was, but I met Arnold Schwarzenegger when I was in 2nd grade because they filmed Kindergarten Cop at my school. I just remember how big he was and remember him laughing when I told him my dad could beat him up. My dad was 5 feet 7 inches, so I'm quite certain I got that one wrong. My kid went to that school. I miss Astoria. Apparently, my former employer's buddy Ben, who we met at the Tex-Mex restaurant in 1998, was a performer named Ben Folds. Seemed a nice enough dude. Had no idea he was a performing artist. After lunch, my boss says, "You do know who that is, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, your friend Ben." Oh, gosh, this reminds me of a friend of my girlfriend and her friend Tom. She's from Indianapolis and saw this lost looking dude at the airport on one of her return trips home. So once she gave him directions to where he needed to be, they decided to grab something to eat. She realized that he was a touring musician and figured he was on the nightclub circuit, and grabbed the check and insisted on it being her treat. And he said, "Well, Tom Petty can pay his own bills." And she said, "Well, Tom, welcome to Indianapolis and this is my treat to welcome you here." So he invites her to the show and that's when she realizes that he's not playing some bar to 80 people, he's headlining to 15,000 people and she's got backstage passes and VIP seats. She and her new friend Tom stayed in touch and he always ghost listed her at shows whenever he was in town and no doubt appreciated being treated like an ordinary dude instead of a rock star.